Hello saints and scholars, welcome back to Theo Life, where today we're going to discuss the universal acceptance of morality. In our last video, we broke down the syllogism of the axiological argument. This syllogism is, premise 1, if all humans have an objective moral value, then a transcendent lawgiver exists. Premise 2, objective moral values do exist, therefore the conclusion being a transcendent lawgiver must exist. Today, let's go into further detail on premise 1 to show that there is a universal acceptance of morality. While it may seem like the world is polarized and everyone's arguing different perspectives, you will note that certain ideas are near universally condemned. While things like human trafficking or genocide or torture do exist, you will find that most societies and most people believe we should take active steps to eradicate those evils. Such behaviors inspire universal condemnation. All civilizations will condemn such rotten behaviors. But we do love a nice cheesy story about a solid do-gooder. Oh my goodness, beautiful example of this, Sir Nicholas Winton. Nicholas Winton was a British stockbroker who helped hundreds of Jewish children escape the horrors of Nazi occupation. Most of the parents of these children actually died in Nazi concentration camps. So after the war, Winton arranged for all of these children to have adoptive families throughout the rest of Europe. Throughout his life, Winton went largely unrecognized until 1988, a British television show brought him into their studio and filled the entire audience with the children that he had saved during World War II, and he was finally recognized for saving hundreds of lives from the Nazi menace. Winton was a beautiful human being, and if you are not crying right now, you don't have a heart and you're not a real person. There is an interesting theory in anthropology about the beginning of civilization. Civilization began with a healed femur bone. The femur bone is the biggest bone in the human body, and someone who has the misfortune of breaking a femur bone can do very little for themselves. They can't stand or work and need constant care from others. Now in the animal kingdom, if you break your femur bone, you're going to die. No one is going to make the huge sacrifices necessary to care for you and look after you and sacrifice their food in order for your survival. But in ancient human beings, we find the wonder of healed femur bones. Think about that for a second. That meant that a community had to care about an individual so much that they were willing to sacrifice their time and their food and their resources in the belief that they wanted this human being to get better. Ancient man believed so much in the value of their fellow man that they organized and made huge sacrifices so this person could continue a long and healthy life. Ooh, that's kind of inspiring to think about that. And we continue to live in a wonderful world where people are fighting for others to have healthcare and clean water and education. People recognize that the re-emergence of the Taliban in Afghanistan is going to be a moral evil. Yet we'll all praise the wonderful work of Malala Yousafzai as she fights for women's education within Afghanistan, even though she was a victim of the Taliban herself. We find throughout history that people will praise morally virtuous actions, yet at the same time recognize other actions as inherently wrong. All civilizations have stories about good guys and bad guys. We love the good guys and girls that make sacrifices to make the world a better place. Oh, and we love it when the bad guy gets their comeuppance in the end. One of the greatest examples of this in all of cinematic history is in that 90s classic Con Air, where Cyrus the Virus has a death scene. Cyrus the Virus is the evil guy. He gets a beating from Nicolas Cage. He gets a pole through his leg. He gets pushed through a bridge. He gets electrocuted on power lines. He falls through a giant building, and just when you want one more death scene, he gets his head crushed in a hydraulic press designed for rocks. It is so sweet. And it's so satisfying because he's such a bad guy and we love to see him die. And if we see something shared by all human beings throughout time, throughout history, and throughout culture, we would note that such a system would have to be inherent in the human psyche. If it is not the product of culture, then it must be the product of something transcendent, therefore pointing to a transcendent lawgiver or God. Let's examine this idea further by looking at two different studies. One would be C.S. Lewis's 8 illustrations of the Tao. In Lewis's study, found in the appendage of The Abolition of Man, we see 8 illustrations of the Tao. The Tao is not a Christian term, but was a term Lewis used to describe the existence of objective transcendent morality. The 8 illustrations of the Tao include the law of general benevolence, which is being good to all people in society, the law of special benevolence, which is those particularly close to you, duties to children and posterity, as well as parents, elders, and ancestors, a law of justice, law of good faith and veracity, which would be keeping one's word and contract law, and finally, the law of magnanimity, which would be kindness. Lewis notes that while these ideas were not always practiced, they were always valued. While the abuse of children or disrespect of the elderly was certainly common in the ancient world, it was not something society valued. A fascinating study by Curry, Mullins, and Whitehouse examined the moral foundations of over 60 societies from all across the world. This study notes that despite the fact that cultures were not connected geographically, religiously, or linguistically, they all share the same moral values. Values like helping your family, dividing resources fairly, and bravery were valued in all of these societies even though they had no prior connection. What's fascinating about this study is it comes to a lot of the same conclusions as Lewis's study. From cultures with a vast array of differences, we see the same universal values. Finally, let's compare this study to the 10 Commandments of Moses. By comparing all 3 studies, we see a tremendous amount of crossover. All groups value the family as a fundamental unit of society. This would be tied up in commandments to not commit adultery and to honor one's father and mother. We see this in the Chicago study, that there is a deferment to superiors and caring for children and ancestors, such as in Lewis's study. All societies seem to contain some concept of private property. This is noted in Lewis's study, which values good faith and veracity or contract law. In the Chicago study, we see a universal respect for other people's property, and in the law of Moses, we see that one should not bear false witness against their neighbor, nor steal from their neighbor, nor covet from their neighbor. We see that within this study, regardless of their place in history or culture, people do share a universal morality. Cruelty is universally rejected, and charity is universally praised. All studies note that these morals are not always practiced, but they are always valued. These studies and more show us a fascinating attribute of the human psyche. Morals do not come from cultural conditioning. If that were the case, we would see drastically different values through different societies throughout history. Yet continuous studies have shown that human beings all possess a core moral center, regardless of their place in culture or history, leading us to the very strong case that morals are not the product of culture or of nature, but of a transcendent being, that being our transcendent lawgiver, or as we all like to call him, God.